Good evening. Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back to the Atlas Society's Monday Night Philosophy. I'm the MC for tonight's webinar, and I'm William R. Thomas, the Director of Programs at the Atlas Society. Tonight's webinar is the third part of a new 5-part series of lectures by my colleague Alexander R. Cohen. And the series is called Objectivism, a Rational Philosophy for the Hero in Your Soul. It's a new brief survey of the philosophy that Ayn Rand founded. Now in this lecture, Alexander R. Cohen will argue that because a human being has a specific nature, there are certain values every one of us needs to pursue and certain ways of pursuing them. The ways of pursuing them are the virtues, and we all need to use them. And some of these virtues are exercised primarily within oneself, and some pertain essentially to one's relationships with others. And this webinar will explore the nature of virtue and introduce the major objectivist virtues. And it'll indicate how virtues relate to survival and to flourishing and to happiness. And it will show how that objectivism's brand of egoism calls for offering others benefits rather than harms. And in the end, that it's a very demanding moral code, but a very needed one. And our speaker tonight is Alexander R. Cohen. He's the managing editor of the Atlas Society's Business Rights Center and an associate scholar at the Atlas Society. You can read his blog and his other articles on business rights on our website. He's earned a bachelor's degree in broadcast journalism from American University and a law degree from the University of Pennsylvania. And then he has gone on to do extensive graduate work in philosophy at the City University of New York, in the doctoral program of the University of Virginia, and in the Atlas Society's graduate seminar, where he's been a student and an instructor. Now, the webinar will begin with a slideshow and live video presentation, and it'll run on the order of 40 or 50 minutes. And after that, there'll be an open question and answer session, which will run as long as people stay connected and seem interested in the discussion. And now, without further ado, I give you Alexander Cohen on the values and virtues of objectivism.
In the first webinar of this series, I asked you to imagine freedom, not just political freedom, but moral freedom, freedom from unchosen duties, the freedom to live for yourself. And I argued that there were certain values and certain moral principles you need to embrace if you choose to live, values and principles that support your life because they are grounded in the nature of human life. Ayn Rand makes the point in Atlas Shrugged in these words: man's life is the standard of morality, but your own life is its purpose. If existence on earth is your goal, you must choose your actions and values by the standard of that which is proper to man, for the purpose of preserving, fulfilling, and enjoying the irreplaceable value which is your life. There are 6 key concepts in this quote I discussed in that first webinar, but I want to review them here. A standard is a point of reference for making evaluations or judgments. If you choose the inch as the standard of measurement of the length of an object, that means you're going to measure its length in inches. When we say that man's life is the standard of morality, what we mean is that a moral judgment of an action is an evaluation of how well that action fits the life of a human being, that is, the life of a rational animal, and that a moral judgment of a person is an evaluation of the extent to which he lives the life of a rational animal. The purpose of an action is the value you're trying to gain by means of that action, or that it would be rational to try to gain by means of that action. So the purpose of baking a cake is to have a cake, and then to eat the cake, or sell the cake, or enjoy the cake with a friend. The purpose of living morally is to live, and to live well. Correspondingly, a value is what you take actions to gain or keep. Values include a career, or a particular job, friendship, or a particular friend, food, or that cake I mentioned. Some values are profoundly important, such as your career. Others are trivial, such as a beer. But if you want to have the best life open to you, you need to make sure that all your values contribute to it. Otherwise, you are diverting your effort away from the project of living. And there are 3 aspects of the project of living. The first is simple to state, if hard to accomplish. remaining alive. I refer to this as survival. The second is the other dimension of life, which I call flourishing. On my interpretation, this refers to living in a way that befits a human being, that is, living by the methods that constitute a rational human life. If this is obscure, I hope it will be less so by the end of tonight's webinar. And the third aspect of the project of living is that you want to live in a way that you'll enjoy, and preferably achieve happiness. Joy comes from achieving your values, and happiness is joy that isn't tainted by knowing you are also working against your values. Spelling out the standard of man's life is the core task of objectivist ethics. Ayn Rand identified the 3 cardinal virtues and 7 major virtues, to which David Kelly added an 8th virtue. These lists of values and virtues form, for the most part, the outline of today's webinar. But these values and virtues are not unrelated goals. Quite the contrary. They are elements of a systematic approach to life, an approach focused on living in reality, an approach that achieves real values. So if I seem at all repetitive, there's a reason. The themes you'll hear repeated tonight are important themes of a rational life. The first of the 3 cardinal values is reason. As I discussed last week, reason identifies and integrates the information gathered by your senses. Reason is a human being's fundamental means of survival because it is reason that gives you the ability to know the world, and it is knowing the world that gives you the ability to act effectively within it. For example, it is through having perceived the structure of a human body and learned how it fits together, how it operates, that a surgeon is able to repair it. That shows that knowledge is a value and that you use reason to gain it. But you might well ask how reason is a value. After all, we seem to have reason naturally, and a value is something one acts to gain and or keep. But action is required to preserve and to cultivate reason. For example, alcohol or various drugs might impair one's reason, so you need to be careful with them. Sugar, on the other hand, can help you focus. Various forms of education and mental training can make you better at reasoning, or at reasoning in certain ways. For example, learning to program can make you better at seeing gaps in arguments, because finding the gaps in the reasoning embodied in a program is part of debugging it. And of course, knowing things can enhance your ability to identify and integrate new information. For example, if you have a lot of knowledge of English, if you know what the letters look like and have an adequate vocabulary, you can identify what it says on this slide. If, on the other hand, you had never encountered any language but Chinese, you couldn't identify what it says on this slide. But you could identify what it said on a comparable slide in Chinese, which I would not be able to read. Moreover, how much you can understand the painting depends on your knowledge of what a human body looks like, the idea of medical training, and the history of Western European men's fashions and styles of painting. An intelligent animal from a species that had never used clothing might not even be able to recognize that the dead thing on the table in the painting is the same species as the living things gathered around it. But you can probably tell, not only, of course, that these are all people and that the live ones are wearing clothing, but by looking at the clothing, approximately when this image is said. The second of the 3 cardinal values is purpose. A human being lives by creating the values he needs to sustain himself. But since only particular things exist, to create is to create something in particular. And that means you need to choose the kind of value you want to create. For example, Nikola Tesla, seen here posing with electricity, chose to create inventions. Ayn Rand chose to create novels. If you are clear about your productive purpose and you are faithful to it, it organizes your life. Many other values will follow from it. I mentioned that Ayn Rand wanted to write novels. Well, she wanted to write novels about ideal men. And that meant she had to define an ideal man. And that meant she had to do a lot of philosophical work in order to know what an ideal man would be and do. She performed a philosophical revolution in order to write a novel. But the organizing power of your productive purpose extends well beyond such obvious matters as learning what you need to know in order to accomplish some task. For example, you may need to live in a particular city in order to do the work you want the way you want. Everything from what you wear to whom you socialize with may be shaped by the purpose you have chosen. Purpose needs to be gained and kept in that you need to choose it. You need to choose it in the sense that there are innumerable purposes a person might choose, and you have to pick the purpose of your life. If the purpose isn't a common one that many people choose, you may need to define it for yourself. And even once you've chosen it, you have to choose it again and again, continually, by making sure that whatever else you choose contributes to it. Even rest is a chance to recuperate in order to go back to your real work. If your purpose isn't well defined and clear to you, you may find yourself adrift, with your life not well organized. And that means that you may be pursuing values that actually work against what you really want. For example, suppose that the work you really want to do is to act. If you adopt acting as the purpose of your life, you'll know that until you can support yourself by acting, you need some other source of income. But you need another source of income that is flexible enough to accommodate your acting. If you took a job that had a strict schedule and was not compatible with auditions and gigs for your acting career, that would be very costly to your acting career, which is your purpose. The third cardinal value is self-esteem. Self-esteem is the conviction that one is worthy of living, that is, fit to live. One way you prove you're fit to live is by going about living. As you observe yourself thinking and acting effectively, you learn from experience that you are capable of thinking well and capable of acting well, that you are capable of figuring things out and achieving values. Another way to prove you're fit to live, and it's best to do both, is to observe yourself living up to your moral principles, especially if you think your moral principles contribute to your life and happiness. But there's another sense of worthiness for life, the belief that you deserve to live. You need to see your life and your happiness as worthy goals, as real values. Seeing your own happiness as valuable means recognizing as a moral matter that you have a right to be concerned with your own good. That requires thinking of yourself as a good person. So that's another reason to make sure that your actions meet your own moral standards. It's also a good reason to make sure your moral standards are good ones. If you adopt standards and don't live by them, you'll experience the guilt that comes from that. But if you do live up to counterproductive standards, you'll harm your own interests. For example, if you believe that you must help the poor, you may give away money that you could have used to start your own business. If you've based your self-esteem on living up to the wrong standards, you may have a hard time admitting it, because that would mean giving up the basis of your belief that you are a good person. It seems to mean seeing yourself as a bad person. If you find yourself afraid of a moral reevaluation, let me offer a bit of advice. There's merit in doing what you think is right, even when you're mistaken. So if you change your mind about what's right, and you change your behavior accordingly, you can still respect yourself for having done what you thought was right. That is, you can recognize that before you changed your mind, you did what you thought was right then, and then you accepted that you had been mistaken, and then you began doing what you think is right now. But if you keep acting on your old principles, even when you know they're wrong, you can no longer say that you're doing what you honestly believe is right. And if you refuse to consider that you might be wrong, you're running away from the truth. Before I proceed to the 8 vital virtues, I want to pause to discuss what a virtue is. A value, as I mentioned, is something you act to gain and keep. Rand at one point defined a virtue as the action by which you gain and keep it. But one action standing alone is not a virtue. A virtue is a regular pattern of conduct, such as a policy or a disposition. And the major virtues have numerous aspects and elements. For example, if you make a decision that you will always hold doors for people who have their hands full, you are adopting a policy of holding doors, which is a form of helpfulness, which falls under the virtue of benevolence. It might at first be a conscious choice, but if you keep doing it, you will train your subconscious and it will become automatic. Of course, you'll still be able to override it consciously. But a virtue isn't just a way of acting. It's the recognition of a principle. And a principle isn't just a rule. It is a recognition of a general fact of reality. For example, I recognize that if I am generally helpful to my colleagues and my friends, they're more likely to be helpful to me. I know that intellectually, and I recognize the principle in action by adopting the conscious policy of being helpful. And through practice, I train my subconscious mind both to recognize the fact and to want to do the actions. I can even enjoy the actions because I know subconsciously, as well as consciously, that they are good, useful actions. Because the principles that drive the virtues are recognitions of facts of reality, the virtues are aspects of keeping myself in touch with reality and making sure my actions actually contribute to my life. This is most obviously the case with the first virtue, the master virtue in Objectivism, rationality. Because the principle behind every virtue identifies a fact of reality, every virtue follows from rationality and the relevant facts. But when we speak of rationality as one of the virtues, we're focusing on the cultivation and use of reason to recognize reality as such. So being rational means recognizing that reality is real, that in order to live in reality, you need to know about reality, that knowing about reality requires thinking about reality, using your mind carefully with a focus on the real world, not merely trying to solve intellectual puzzles. Rationality means recognizing that in order to think and know about reality, you need to choose to think, and you need to choose to think about the right things, paying attention to such matters as the importance and urgency of an issue. If you are on the verge of starving to death, for example, you need to think about getting food. Unless you are so confused about metaphysics that your metaphysical mistakes are getting in the way of finding food, you don't need to reflect on metaphysics at that moment. Or, if you need to get a new job, you probably shouldn't be spending too much time figuring out the details of how you'd move to a new city if you got a job there. Unless you're concerned that you might not be able to make the move at all, you probably don't need to think about the details of the move until you have the job in that city. From the negative side, rationality means recognizing that if you let anything get in the way of thinking about reality, you're letting it interfere with your ability to live. Hence the portrait of Galileo, who is revered for his loyalty to reason and his refusal to let anything stop him from recognizing the truth. So, for example, it's dangerous to let your feelings prevail over your reason. Just because you feel like doing something doesn't mean what is actually best for you. You need to think the matter through. And just because a particular political outcome would make you feel good, it doesn't mean that that policy would be just. Likewise, it's dangerous to value any conclusion more than fidelity to reason. For example, I think that in general, government interference in the market is destructive and tends to reduce production. I have good reasons to think that. I also think it violates people's rights, and I have reasons for that too, which we'll discuss next week. But if I value being rational, I have to be prepared to consider evidence that some particular interference might actually increase wealth. For example, some economists think that some aspects of antitrust law actually do make businesses produce better goods and services at lower prices than they otherwise would while still making a profit. And some people have argued that in countries with generous welfare states and single-payer healthcare systems, people are more willing to take the risk of starting their own businesses, and that increases productivity. If I approach the economic questions with the attitude that I'll reject any evidence that suggests that free enterprise doesn't maximize wealth production, then I'm rejecting rationality. Now, of course, as we'll see next week, the objectivist case for free enterprise is not based on the premise that it maximizes wealth production. It's based on people's right to run their own lives and pursue value for themselves. And as I've argued, antitrust law turns the morality of free enterprise on its head. So my moral evaluation of antitrust would remain in place, even if antitrust really does increase total wealth. And that's rational, because my view of antitrust is based on facts other than total production. I could say much the same about socialized medicine. But it would not be rational to insist, without regard to the evidence, that the policy that is morally best must also produce the highest GDP. When there isn't even a basis for the commitment, we call that faith, commitment to a belief without evidence or argument, and without regard for evidence or argument. And now is a good time to remember that happiness is joy without contradiction, what you feel when you're attaining your values without working against them. And reason is your means of pursuing whatever values you pursue, including life itself. So if you adopt any value that you're willing to weigh against reason, if you value any commitment, even at the expense of rationality, you put yourself in a position where the pursuit of one value works against your other values. That limits your potential for happiness. You practice rationality by thinking, and thinking clearly, by using logic and identifying facts of reality, and by doing this to the best of your ability. Thinking always requires choosing to think, but you can at least accustom yourself to doing that, and in that sense, make rationality habitual. Since flourishing is living in the manner of a rational animal, rationality is obviously part of it. Rationality contributes to a bright sense of life and to your self-esteem in several ways. It enables you to see the world clearly. And that means seeing the world as a place that makes sense, a place that's open to your action and your success. It means seeing yourself clearly, that is, recognizing your own ability to understand the world and therefore to act in it. And it enables you to take effective action and thereby to recognize that you do take effective action. Closely related to rationality is independence, by which objectivism primarily means cognitive independence, independence of thought. If I ask you how many lights there are in the picture, you will, I am fairly confident, give me Captain Picard's famous answer: there are 4 lights. If I say there are 5, you will know that I am wrong. And even if I give you an incentive to say that there are 5, and even if you choose to lie to me and to say that there are 5, you will still know that there are 4. That's independence. What independence recognizes is that thinking is an individual process, something one person does. In order to gain reliable knowledge, you need to think for yourself. If you rely on someone else's assertions, you expose yourself to risks of error you can't control. And the more blindly you rely on someone else's statements, the more exposed you are to errors. Maybe the other person is lying. Maybe the other person is mistaken. Maybe the other person is repeating something that he doesn't dare challenge. And maybe the other person is, in fact, stating a fact. If you simply accept his say-so, you have no way of figuring out which is the case. And thinking is of the essence of a rational life. So if you let others do your thinking, you aren't living as a human being. You're just riding on their efforts to do so. Since the point of thinking is to identify reality, independent thinking, at least when it lives up to its purpose, is thinking about reality. Identifying independence as a distinct virtue emphasizes that you need to focus on reality, not on other people's opinions, even their opinions about reality. You need to face reality yourself, at first hand. This, of course, contributes to self-esteem, because by focusing on reality, you can see yourself as someone who is engaged in living in the world. And you can know, because you are judging your own actions, that you are acting successfully in the world. On the other hand, if you focus on others' opinions, it may turn out that your actions are not efficacious in reality, and that if you base your self-respect on other people's judgment of your merits, your self-esteem is in their hands and can be destroyed by them. But it's also important to note some things that independence is not. Independence does not mean disregarding the evidence of others' testimony. The fact that someone said something is a fact, so it's rational to take it into account. But to make rational use of it, you need to consider it in the context of the other evidence that you have. You need to consider, for example, whether you have any evidence to back up or refute what the other person says. You need to consider whether the other person is in a position to know what he is talking about, and whether he is likely to be telling you the truth to the best of his ability. What do you know about his character? What do you know about his incentives? If your honest friend who just came in says it's cold outside, you can judge that he is probably telling the truth. The best explanation for the fact that he says it's cold out is that it is in fact cold out and he knows it. If someone says there are 5 lights when you can plainly see that there are 4, as in the Star Trek episode, you know that he is saying something false. And then the question for you to explore is, why is he saying that? Is he mistaken? Is he lying? Is he trying to subvert my grip on reality? What's going on here? Either way, if you want to know the truth, you need to consider the evidence and evaluate it for yourself. That includes the testimonial evidence. Independence does not mean not seeking advice or instruction. Again, it means judging what other people say. Maybe someone else's advice will call your attention to an aspect of a situation that you had not considered, or that you had not given enough weight. Maybe a lecture will lay out a convincing argument, or help you organize the evidence that you already have. Maybe you'll be able to verify what the lecturer says. Maybe the lecturer's testimony, when you consider the reasons you have to think he's being honest, and the reasons you have to think he knows his subject, will be good enough. Again, the important thing is to judge, and to remain willing to judge. And independence does not mean refusing to consider what others will do. For example, if I were in the position Captain Picard is in here, if I had been captured and my captor were trying to torture me into saying there were 5 lights when there were 4, I might well say there were 5 lights as soon as I realized that's what he wanted. I wouldn't try to think there were 5 lights. I wouldn't even try to make him think I thought there were 5 lights. I'd just say, okay, you want me to say the words, there are 5 lights? I'll say them. There are 5 lights. What words would you like me to say next? Similarly, if what you think is the best thing to do might get you fired or arrested, you need to consider that. You need to weigh those consequences. But in order to weigh them rationally, you need to consider what the actual facts are, what you think, how you judge the other aspects of the situation. You need to consider the implications of each option. If your boss demands that you do something that's worse than giving up your job, something, for example, that compromises your character, then you need to give up your job. That said, even when you're paying attention to such incentives as this, you need to be careful to make sure that you don't become too attuned to what other people think instead of to the underlying facts. And that can be a struggle. And that brings us to integrity. One of the most famous moments in Ayn Rand's novel The Fountainhead comes when Howard Rourke, the architect and the main character of the book, is asked to modify one of his designs in violation of his architectural principles. He refuses. And he refuses even though there would be a lot of money and future opportunities available to him if he accepted the proposal. And even though the proposal comes at a time when he is very short of money. He refuses because he understands that if he becomes a rich and famous architect in this way, he won't be able to do architecture his way. He won't be able to do the work he loves in the way he loves. The people who will hire him will expect more of this sort of work, this compromised work. He'll have to betray his professional purpose at every step. Rejecting such an offer is an example of integrity. Integrity means putting your judgment into action, not just thinking that something is the right thing to do, but actually doing it. It means that you don't just claim to hold principles, you live by them. And you live by your principles because you recognize that your principles are in fact principles about what works in reality, and that your real interest, even when you're tempted to do otherwise, lies in following those principles. Integrity also means recognizing that you are yourself, that you are an individual with a personal identity. You have chosen a certain purpose and certain values, and if you want to attain them, you need to actually pursue them. Indeed, if you do not act to pursue your values, you don't really value them at all. An architect who would do whatever his clients wanted wouldn't be someone who valued a particular vision of architecture. He'd be someone who merely valued getting paid or being famous. Integrity is necessary for happiness, because if you let yourself stroll away from your real values and principles, the values you pursue will be contradictory to the ones that are most meaningful to you, and your joy will be compromised by the recognition that you are abandoning those higher values. Integrity is part of flourishing, because the life of a rational man isn't just a life in which you think. It's a life in which you act on your thinking. A life in which your actions are governed by your thinking. And assuming your principles are in fact the principles that, if you follow them, tend toward survival, integrity contributes to survival by seeing to it that you do actually follow those principles. Next on our list is justice. Where integrity includes the recognition that you are who you are, justice is the recognition that the other person is who he is. It's rationality applied to evaluating people. So in Objectivism, unlike other philosophies, justice is fundamentally an individual virtue, not a characteristic of a good society or a function of its government. People vary, morally and otherwise. Some people are tremendous sources of value. Others are tremendous sources of danger. Seen here is Larry Page, one of Google's founders, original programmers, and executives. Some people think that Larry Page is a great source of danger, but he is, in fact, a great source of value. To say that he is a great source of danger is an injustice. The other key principle that the just person recognizes is that it's very valuable to know whether a person is a source of value or a threat. Encouraging people to be better sources of value can lead to more value in the world for you, and discouraging threats can keep you safe. More importantly, you get to choose most of the people you associate with, and in doing so, you need to evaluate them accurately in order to estimate what effect associating with them will have on your life. Remember, you need to seek value in all your dealings, all your actions. So you need to make sure that your relationships are valuable. And what value there is in a relationship depends largely on who the other person is. That principle applies to all your relationships. Your spouse, if you choose to have one, your friends, your employers, your employees, if you have such, the professionals you work with, the merchants you buy from, your teachers and students, relatives to the extent you have a choice, whatever kinds of relationships, whatever roles people have in your life. You need to seek value in everything you do, and that includes all your relationships. As with all tasks of identifying reality, judging others takes work. You can't afford to put the same care into picking the person who sells you a candy that you would put into picking the person to marry. Of course, the more carefully you judge a person, the more you can rely on that judgment. Although your moral character is relevant to your fitness for all kinds of relationships, justice isn't just about moral judgment. It's about whatever's relevant. So, for example, if you're picking someone for a professional relationship, you need to justly evaluate that person's suitability for that particular professional relationship. It would be unjust to hire me to translate Chinese, because as I mentioned, I don't know Chinese. And if you're picking someone to be friends with, having a similarity of sense of life and a similarity of purpose will be quite relevant. For example, I tend to enjoy the company of people who go out and fight for causes, even people who go out and fight for causes that I don't agree with. Even people who go out and fight for causes that I think are, at least in part, unjust. That is a moral failing I am attributing to them, and yet there is a similarity that gives them value in the context of friendship. Of course, justice isn't just the recognition that the other individual is the specific individual that he is, with his own merits and his own flaws. It's also the recognition that he's a person, and that as such, he is the goal of his own life, and he needs to think and act in order to obtain the values that sustain and fulfill his life. Thus, a core element of justice is the idea of trade, gaining value in social interactions through voluntary exchange to mutual advantage. Giving value for value means that I give you something that contributes to your life, and you give me something that contributes to mine. But it's not just something valuable that makes a value for trade, it's something the other person actually does value, something he seeks to gain. Producing products for trade is a way of sustaining one's own life because those products are actually valued by others and can therefore be exchanged, directly by barter or indirectly by means of money, for something that contributes more directly to one's own life. Seeking trades that are to mutual advantage, and there's a reason I'm going out of order, honors the principle that each person seeks his own good, and it honors that principle in two ways. First, because you're seeking your own advantage, you're acting on the premise that your own good is the purpose of your action. And second, you're treating the other person as the purpose of his own action by acknowledging that he has no reason to trade with you unless he also gains by the trade. If you want him to seek more interactions with you, you need to make sure that his interactions with you are to his benefit. If the trade is to mutual advantage, why does it need to be voluntary? Well, that recognizes the principle that each person needs to act on his own independent judgment. If I impose something on you for your own good as I see it, I'm denying you the opportunity to judge your own good. That's depriving you of a key aspect of living by your own judgment. And it's a threat because even if I happen to be right that you ought to choose what I'm giving you, I'm denying you the opportunity to protect yourself from my errors. It makes me, that is, a threatening, dangerous person. Because even if I'm right in this case, I may not be right next time. The paradigm of trade is a straightforward commercial trade, such as buying lunch at a food truck. But trade is much more than that. It includes, of course, long-term business relationships, such as employment. But it also includes social relationships, such as friendships. In a friendship, you're not keeping track of exactly who owes what to whom. You do favors more freely than that. Nor are friendships only about trading favors. They include such matters as the pleasure you take in one another's company. But you do expect that on the whole, both parties will benefit from the friendship, or it's not a friendship that's worth having. Next up, honesty. Because rational, productive, perceptive people are able to understand the world and act effectively in it, there's value in dealing with them. But if your methods of dealing with people rest on deceiving them, then the rationality and perceptiveness of the people you deal with becomes a threat, and you have to act to preserve their errors. After all, if they realize that you did not have the value you deceived them into thinking you had, they will, in justice, have less reason or no reason to continue to deal with you. Thus, if you deceive others, you have to try to escape their perception, possibly even by seeking out people who have less ability to judge, but who therefore have less value to offer you. Love, respect, or fame obtained by deceiving others is in a very real sense unreal. It's unreal because love, respect, or fame directed to a false image of you isn't love, respect, or fame directed towards you. It doesn't give you the experience of being valued, that is, of being valued for who you are. Indeed, it denies you that experience because the people who see the false image of you may include the people you'd like to have see the real you, the people who would actually value the real you. Imagine, for example, that you are a smart, intellectually active, even nerdy young person, and you observe that most of the people around you are interested in associating with people of quite a different sort. You might, in order to pursue their interests, dumb yourself down, at least in public. This may make them more interested in getting to know you. But those people interested in getting to know you will still be people whom you don't respect. Where's the value in that? Moreover, those people whom you do respect, people who would be good people for you to get to know, won't realize what you have to offer. So the relationships that would actually be valuable for you are not going to be available. Having to focus on the false images you create for others may distract you from the real world and get you confused between the true and the false. And that's not just the case in the sense in which spending too much time in a fictional world can get in the way of paying attention to reality. You may have to live in reality according to what only makes sense in the false world that your false persona lives in. For example, in order to maintain your image, You may need to avoid pursuing what you value in order not to be seen pursuing it. That's one way in which dishonesty produces unhappiness, sending you off after false values. Here's another. Dishonesty makes other people's perceptiveness a threat, and that threat, being always present, is a source of fear. When you gain value because someone has misperceived what you offer or offered, even if you didn't cause the error, you aren't gaining that value through producing the equivalent. It's unearned, or at least hasn't been judged to be earned. And that means you aren't sustaining your life by means of trade. It also means that you are living in an unreal world created by that mistake, thus separating yourself from reality. This brings us to one of Objectivism's most distinctive virtues, productiveness. Productiveness recognizes that life is a process of self-sustaining action, and that you sustain your life by creating the values on which you live. That means recognizing that you want, I could even say need, values, and that you can achieve them. And creating values requires making the choice to focus your mind on creating values. Man, unlike other animals, adapts his environment to himself. Productiveness is the virtue by which we do that. Productiveness relies on and demonstrates the premise that you can shape the world to suit you. Thus, you actually see yourself shaping the world, and you see that the world is a world that you can shape. There's a distinction that I think is important to make when talking about productiveness, and that is the distinction between productiveness and productivity. Productiveness is a matter of moral virtue, pertaining to focusing on creating value, whereas productivity measures the value that you create. So, for example, a brilliant person may produce a lot of value when he troubles himself to bother producing value at all, but yet he may waste a lot of his time. He's not being very productive in the moral sense, even if he is in the sense of productivity. A moral person, on the other hand, without a lot of intelligence, may work a lot of hours and may work those hours to the best of his ability, and yet he may not produce a great deal of value. To give a more concrete example, you might see a senior partner who is highly intelligent in a law firm producing a great deal of value, even if he only actually sits down to work a few hours a day. He may yet produce more value than the hardest working janitor in the building. And yet we might say that in terms of the virtue of productiveness, the janitor is earning more respect. The next virtue is pride, a word that rejects the idea of thinking little of yourself that is sometimes implied by calling humility a virtue. Pride recognizes that all of your actions are taken by you. That is to say, your actions are taken by who you are, including your subconscious premises, your conscious premises, and your dispositions. So, for example, your moral beliefs, the subconscious counterparts to those beliefs that you've developed over the years of trying to live by them as well. The virtue of pride recognizes that you create your own character. Here's one of my favorite lines from Galt's speech. Man is a being of self-made soul. Pride recognizes that in order to have good actions and achieve good results, you need to shape your own character. And you need to shape it according to the right standards. You need to shape the premises that you consciously accept. You need to shape your subconscious mind by all the various ways that are available to you to do that, by the conscious premises you accept, by the habits you get into, by the pleasures you pursue. Nothing can take priority over shaping your own self, because that is going to have ramifications for everything else that you do. What follows from that? Well, what follows from that includes that you have to value your actions or disvalue potential actions based on their effect on your character. You need to actually think about moral questions, both applied and theoretical. You need to choose a moral code carefully. And you need to take the actions that will lead to developing the virtues. You need, for example, to be rational in small things, not only because being rational in small things gets you the value that's to be had in the small things, but because it contributes to having the virtue of rationality when you need it for the big things. Unlike the first 7 virtues, which Rand enumerates in Galt's speech and the Objectivist ethics, the virtue of benevolence was introduced by David Kelly in a book called Unrugged Individualism. Benevolence rests on the recognition that there is a lot of value to be found in other people. That it has in common with justice. But benevolence calls our attention to the fact that it takes a lot of time and effort to discern the value that others have to offer. And it takes investment to develop relationships with others. And to some extent, for this to succeed, it has to begin before you have proof of the value that the other person offers. And moreover, there is value in being in a community of people who are doing well. Because a person is not necessarily entirely without value just because he has some flaw, even some moral flaw, benevolence calls our attention to the good potential that may exist even in a flawed person. It asks us to remember that we haven't seen everything about a person. Now, that doesn't mean that we disregard the flaws. Benevolence is not in contradiction to justice. It does mean that we don't rush to condemn, that we continue to look for good potential in those we don't know about and in those we don't know enough about. And that we continue, where it isn't overwhelmed, to value that which is good, even in a person whom we have seen the bad in. Benevolence includes rendering assistance to others, including in the context of relationships and including beyond them. Benevolence can include material assistance, such as emergency rescue, based on the potential value of the other person, and based also on the value of the custom of helping people in emergencies. Because after all, you might be in an emergency yourself at some point. And often in such cases, there is a lot more value to be gained by the person receiving the assistance than what it costs the person providing it. Benevolence also includes spiritual assistance, that is, assistance pertaining to the person's character and mind. Spiritual assistance can come in the form of offering opportunities. Material assistance can come in that form as well. It can come in the form of offering incentives. And it can come in the form of offering advice. One form of spiritual assistance that I offer is something I call Your Life is Worth an Hour, where I've made a commitment to anybody I know even well enough to be Facebook friends with the person, that if that person is considering killing himself, I am willing to give an hour of my time to talking about that person and trying to help that person see the value in his or her own life. Now, benevolence does not mean coercion. Remember that justice tells us that the other person has to judge for himself. That's why part of my commitment in Your Life is Worth an Hour is that I don't go and call the police on the person. Other people, other objectivists, may disagree with me on that particular point. But certainly, more broadly, it is quite clear that assisting somebody in developing his character or assisting him in any other way is not a justification for coercing him. And on that note, let me see if I can assist you with your questions.
Well, hello, everyone. This is your MC, William Thomas, back, inviting you all to submit your questions or bring any questions to us that you have. Oh, here's a good question from Charlie Brown. Welcome back, Charlie. Charlie says, what about virtues? What about other virtues from religion? Can they be integrated? The example he gives is courage. He says, like courage.
Okay, well, let me first begin by saying that from religion is not the relevant question here, in this sense. And I'm sorry to be editing your question, but the issue is not, no virtue is going to be rejected as irrational merely because certain religions happen to think that it is a virtue. So if religion traditionally says that courage is a virtue, then you have to evaluate that and say, well, is courage really a virtue? Is this a disposition that is actually going to help you attain values? You have to say, well, what are the principles that are recognized by courage? And likewise, if you take another virtue from religion, say faith, you have to ask the same questions about that. Now, faith, as I mentioned, is a so-called virtue, making air quotes here, you can't even see them, air quotes. Faith is a virtue that is actually a vice. It is putting something else over your judgment of reality. It is saying, well, I'm going to have confidence in God independently of whether there's any evidence that there even is a God, let alone that he's going to do me any good. So there is something that is a quote-unquote virtue coming from religion that is actually a vice. On the other hand, you mentioned courage. Now, courage, we can actually say, is part of integrity, because courage means recognizing the very real nature of the values that you are pursuing, recognizing that there are risks that have to be run in order to attain them, and once you've recognized that the value is worth the risk, actually running that risk. So, for example, if you believe to take the classic example that Aristotle would like, if you believe that your particular political order is very valuable to you and it's protecting your rights and so forth, and you see that there is a threat to it from an invading army, and you go and you put yourself, as the song says, between your loved home and the war's desolation. That's an act of courage. But it's an act of courage that is, and it's an act of courage because you are actually out there fighting and taking risks for real values, or for what you perceive to be real values. I would say for it to be a truly virtuous act, it has to be a genuinely real value. Other actions that might require courage. Giving up a steady job to start your own business. You see the value that's to be attained there. You see that it's worth the risk, and you take the risk, and you deal with the fear that comes with that, and you face that because you see the real value to be gained, and you are loyal to the pursuit of that value. So, Charlie, I hope you found that answer to be suitable, and to address all aspects of your question, even if not quite in keeping with your exact phrasing.
Well, Alexander Kalia, who had her hand up, wrote in with a couple questions rather than asking them, although I'll unmute you again in case you want to ask these, Kalia. Are you live on your microphone? No? Well, I'll read your questions then. She says...
Let's go one at a time.
She says her microphone doesn't appear to be working. She says, aren't all virtues and values derived from reason applied to man as man? That's one of the questions. Aren't all virtues?
Okay. The answer to that is yes, they are.
Very good. The second question is, please explain the differences.
Let me just backtrack on that. All moral values and virtues are derived from reason as applied to man, qua man. You need more than just the basic facts about human nature to identify all the values in the world. For example, I have here some chocolate. Now, Aristotle, no matter, for all his insight on human nature, even if he had had the additional insights on human nature that Ayn Rand had, given the botanical evidence available to him, could never have discerned the value of chocolate because he never encountered chocolate. He could never have said, hey, chocolate is a value. It took the people who actually saw chocolate to say that chocolate is a value. But certainly the moral values are moral values because they pertain to the standard of man qua man.
So that's a good distinction between the moral values, which are universal to all human beings, based in the universal human nature of man qua man, and the particular values that each of us has in virtue of our own life and the particular circumstances of our lives and the context of knowledge that we have.
That's right. And the ancient Greek word for virtue is the same as the more general word for excellence, arete. And likewise, we can say, hey, look, being good at reading Greek is an excellence, and it embodies recognition of certain facts and development of certain dispositions and so forth. And in those ways it is very similar to a moral virtue. But it's only an excellence that's available to certain people, and it's only worth pursuing for certain people. Because for some people it pertains to their purposes, and for other people it does not.
We've got another question here, Alexander, from Professor Jeffrey Borrowdale. Lovely to have you with us, Jeffrey. He asks, are the objectivist virtues empirically falsifiable in the same way as other beliefs? He remarks that antitrust might be shown to be economically beneficial, but that it violates individual rights. But aren't those rights also derived empirically from studying what man needs to survive and thrive?
Well, certainly everything in objectivism is based on looking at reality. So yes, you could look for facts that would show that the virtues turn out not to be virtues. You could try to look for facts that show that, in fact, we ought to associate with people completely indiscriminately, making no distinction between good and bad. You could look for the facts that actually show that that is a way to live that conduces to success as a human being. You could go look for that. Let me know how it works out. You know, there are real reasons grounded in reality for these claims, as I hope I've shown. And if there were evidence to bring in against them, then that would certainly be admissible. But bear in mind that these are claims based on observations that are open to all of us and that are made routinely, I think, by all of us. And that's why the arguments should seem pretty powerful as soon as you look at them. And so I do not expect to see any of them falsified. In fact, I am quite certain that they will not be. They may, some of the more detailed claims may be, but not the general propositions. Not the major virtues, maybe some of the aspects of them. The information behind them is a lot less obscure than the information involved in ascertaining whether antitrust is good or bad from the perspective of gross domestic product.
But certainly objectivist ethics is meant to be a technology for living well, and in that sense all of its principles are as falsifiable as any principle of engineering is falsifiable, as any law of science is falsifiable, and in just that sense. And in just that sense, we're trying to create a philosophy that is as little subject to doubt as physics and principles of engineering are subject to doubt. That is, they're not very subject to doubt because they're well-founded in fact. Just a little editorial comment from your MC. Charlie Brown writes in to ask you a slightly technical question. Asks, why did Rand use the term cardinal to characterize certain moral values and certain moral virtues? So reason, purpose, and self-esteem are the cardinal values of objectivism, and in that same essay, The Objectivist Ethics, Rand calls rationality, productiveness, and pride the cardinal virtues that correspond to those cardinal values. And I'm happy to talk about why the cardinal values are called cardinal, but you can go ahead, Alexander.
Well, I'm not entirely sure, but I'll take a stab at it and say that the cardinal values and the cardinal virtues are the more fundamental ones compared to other values and virtues. That, particularly when you look at the virtues, the virtues other than rationality, productiveness, and pride are much more closely related to rationality than productiveness and pride are. So, in a sense, they are primary and the others are corollary to one of them. That I think would be what I would say. Will, you might want to add to that. Will, you've just gone mute.
Yes, actually, I had muted myself to not make noise. Alexander, if you would be willing to make me presenter for just a second, I can add a slide that people might find. Yeah. Okay. One of the reasons that the cardinal values are called cardinal values is because they correspond to the fundamental features of valuing. That is, when you have a living, remember that life is the ultimate value in objectivism, and the living process is the fundamental basis of the ethics, and living is what objectivism is all about. The ethics is all about. So the reason is your means. Any life cycle involves a means of acting. Let me see, I can get back to a slide where I do this. Or I can't. Oh, because I'm not doing a slideshow. There we go. Okay, so any living life process involves using some means like your senses, your limbs, your claws, your teeth, tools, whatever those means are, to achieve some ends like food, shelter, safety, pleasure, knowledge, friends and family, things like that, all of which are values to you, and those redound to the benefit of the beneficiary, and keeping that cycle going, that is acting, choosing action, choosing some means to achieve some ends that end up supporting your ongoing process of living, is the process of life. And for a human being, those things are essentially reason as our tool of knowledge and our fundamental way of taking action in the world, of guiding our action, and purpose as choosing consciously to act for values, and then self and self-esteem as the valuing of oneself at a conscious, rational level. That corresponds to the pole of the beneficiary. So that's an analysis, too, which I've seen reflected in the scholarship of Alan Gotthelf writing on this issue, and David Kelly writing on this issue, and so that's just some more grist for that mill. And with that, Alexander, you're welcome to take back control of your webinar.
Okay, so next question. And thank you, Will, for the further slides and your insights on this question.
We appear to be out of philosophy questions at this point. Otherwise, just a few commentaries came in. Thank you all for your commentaries, and thanks. Charlie writes in to say thanks. Thank you, Charlie. So on that note, I leave any final remarks in your hands, Alexander.
Final remarks. Well, that was a very short Q&A. Are we sure nobody else wants to ask questions? Come on, guys.
No, we have thank you. You're welcome.
Well, then, thank you for attending the webinar.